The city of Anniston, Alabama, has long been known for its deeply rooted religious life. Historic churches here date back to almost the 19th century, and most residents have always been closely associated with local denominations. Among these religious communities, a church called Holy Revival stood out, where Elijah Griffin has been pastoring for several years now. He is a dark-haired man in his mid-40s with a rich and expressive voice that can charm even the most skeptical parishioners. His bright charisma and ability to influence the audience quickly made him a favorite of the local community, which is rather conservative but open to strong spiritual leaders. Elijah's wife, Miriam Griffin, is much younger than her husband, about 35. When she first arrived in Anniston a few years ago, she seemed to embody kindness and humility. After their quick marriage, everyone around them said they were the perfect couple, true harmony. Their home, located just a few street corners from the church, was small but cozy. Miriam eagerly helped her husband in his pastoral endeavors. She oversaw preparations for Sunday tea, greeted parishioners at the entrance, and handed out booklets with passages from the scriptures. Sometimes she spoke to the congregation herself, but mostly she preferred to stay in the shadows, letting Elijah shine. But recently their shared idol began to crack. People noticed that while the couple continued to be friendly in front of others, there was something unnaturally forced about their gestures and remarks, as if they were undergoing a hidden tension. Some attributed this to the financial difficulties facing the church. The roof had to be completely replaced, and the costs of charity events were so large that any income from donations turned into a minus. Everyone was expecting Elijah to take decisive action. Either he would ask for more financial support from the community, or he would start cutting back on expenses. However, it was not an easy decision to make. Pressure from the religious council, close attention from the city authorities, and the need to maintain the image of a prosperous, holy revival church kept Griffin on his toes. At the same time, something went wrong in the Griffin family. The couple had been dreaming of children for quite some time, but several years of attempts had not brought them the desired parenthood. Miriam felt increasingly depressed. In the evenings, Elijah would usually sit silently on the bed and immerse himself in reviewing some financial reports, cost and profit tables, and make notes in his notebook. When Miriam would quietly ask him what was wrong, he would just brush it off. "Everything is fine, dear. We just need to find a way to save the church." But the woman could see that her husband's phone was ringing off the hook almost every night with strange calls. He answered in a muffled voice, sometimes went outside to talk, and returned with a nervous expression. The history of Anniston's religious community, which had its roots in the 19th century, was the backdrop for the Griffin family's life, and problems began to accumulate. Despite the enthusiastic support of the congregation and Elijah's vibrant pastoral ministry, these small signs of trouble seemed to hint that much more difficult trials might lie ahead. Neither the congregation nor the couple seemed to realize how dramatically their lives would change when all the secrets came to light. But for now, Elijah, with his deep faith and gift for inspiring people, and Miriam, with her embodiment of humility and kindness, seemed to have the situation under control. However, there was already a tension in the air, as if the elements were about to explode, disrupting the normal way of life of the Anniston religious community. One morning, as soon as Miriam was able to get out of bed, because her varicose veins were causing her severe pain again, she noticed Elijah sitting in the kitchen in front of a pile of papers, probably bills, letters from banks or suppliers. His eyes looked so desperate that she was literally numb. But when he noticed her presence, he immediately tried to recover. "Good morning, my dear. How are you feeling? Are your legs still bothering you?" "To tell you the truth, they hurt even worse than yesterday," she sighed, carefully sitting down in a chair. "Maybe I should change doctors or—" Miriam fell silent for a moment. "And I see you're not in the best shape either. Are those, uh, people still calling?" Elijah frowned at first, then smiled forcibly. "Ah, nothing. I'm dealing with that roof. It needs to be repaired immediately. And I'll find you the best specialist. I already know one. Everything will be fine." His answer sounded evasive, and Miriam felt he was hiding something. But she trusted her husband. They had been living together for several years, and the pastor had never put her in danger. He probably just didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. The same day after the Sunday sermon, when Elijah again appealed to the congregation to not lose hope and support the church, A bearded man in a modest jacket approached him at the entrance. Miriam saw him grab Elijah's elbow out of the corner of her eye and say something angrily. The pastor flinched as if about to explode with irritation, but quickly restrained himself and took the stranger aside, away from everyone else. Miriam was about to approach, but was distracted by parishioners who asked her to pray for a sick relative. In the evening, a kind of oppressive silence reigned at home. Miriam asked who the man was, but Elijah just waved it off. It's nothing serious. The lender decided that the payments were late. I'll take care of it tomorrow. Looking into his eyes, Miriam realized that the situation was definitely not that simple, but she remained silent again. The questions kept coming, and she had no clear answer to any of them. With sadness, the woman realized that an invisible but painful obstacle seemed to be standing between her and her beloved. But the decisive moment came when her legs hurt so badly that she had to go for a thorough examination. The hospital informed her that she needed to take serious treatment, from physiotherapy and blood thinners to compression stockings. However, there were no hints of amputation. However, an ominous thought crept into Elijah's mind as he was reading an insurance brochure. What if? No, it's horrible, but still, wouldn't it ease my debts? It was out of these terrible thoughts that the sinful plan was born. It could have deprived Miriam of her legs, and Elijah of his reputation, and even more. Late one night, filled with anxiety, the pastor sat in his church office and scrolled through various materials on the internet about insurance payments. An ad caught his eye. Get up to $1,300,000 in case of critical limb loss or death. Everything inside him shrank. It was a huge amount of money, and the mechanism for receiving this money sounded terrible. Mentally, it tore him apart. Was he really capable of such cruelty? However, the dry numbers spoke for themselves. Debts were growing, creditors were pressuring, and the pastor's status was in jeopardy. If only Miriam had lost her legs, he timidly suggested. If only she had stayed alive. Isn't that an unacceptable sin? But the seed of sinful intent had already sprouted in his soul. Miriam's health was deteriorating, painful varicose veins accompanied by constant swelling. The two elderly doctors who examined her insisted that nothing catastrophic had happened yet, and that the situation could be kept under control and surgery could be avoided. But when the woman told her husband that things are not that bad, the doctors prescribed medication, Elijah suddenly objected. No, I know a specialist with a much better approach, Dr. White. She will cure you for sure. At first glance, this was just being considerate, but behind the scenes, the pastor was already discussing something very different with the doctor. Dr. Kendra White was quite well known in town for her unconventional treatments, but people whispered that she was doing double bookkeeping, that she could fudge a diagnosis for a fee, giving either a more threatening or a more lenient assessment, depending on the order. One of her patients recalled that she once almost got into a scandal with an insurance company when her expert opinions miraculously did not coincide with reality, but the case was hushed up. Elijah met with this doctor late in the evening, allegedly accidentally meeting her at the exit of a small clinic in the heart of Anniston. The conversation resembled something like Aesop's fables. Dr. White, I've heard rumors that you are the best at dealing with vascular pathologies. My wife has a very complicated situation as I see it, the pastor began. But if everything is properly formalized, we can avoid unnecessary troubles, she replied with a subtle, distant smile. I hope we can get along. As a minister of God, I am always grateful to those who support my family, Elijah hinted. The doctor understood perfectly, and they agreed to meet soon in her private office to go over Miriam's history in depth. Meanwhile, at home, the atmosphere was getting more and more heated. Miriam began to suspect that her husband was hiding something, who he was seeing, and what he was looking for. More and more often, the pastor came home late and was silent. When she asked him what kind of conversations were going on in the middle of the night, he would irritably brush them off. Oh, I'm organizing a charity event, or I'm asked to help someone, to take them to the hospital, or to advise a psychologist. I'm a pastor. Miriam still believed him and worried that perhaps he was being put in charge of too much. Still, her anxiety sometimes made itself felt. One of the parishioners told her cautiously after the service, Mrs. Griffin, I saw your husband with a dubious doctor. I think we should check the paper she's writing. However, the woman did not want to hear it. She convinced herself that it must be someone else's gossip. Elijah wishes me well. For several days in a row, Pastor Griffin did not return home until late at night. He would sit in the living room for hours, looking through old medical reference books, or go outside to talk on the phone for a long time. Miriam tried to remain calm, but she felt that there was a break in their marriage. They used to read prayers together before going to bed, discussing news about the city and new parishioners. Now this warmth and sincere conversations were gone. The discomfort in her legs was getting worse, so she decided to see a doctor she had known for a long time and trusted completely. But when Elijah heard about it, he suddenly exploded. Why do you need another doctor? Don't you realize that your friend is just a charlatan? Dr. White is the one who is really competent. The always balanced and attentive pastor spoke sharply and even dismissively, which shocked Miriam. She tried to take his harshness as an expression of caring, but inside she was filled with fear of such changes. In addition, Elijah began to press on the moral and religious aspects. When Miriam complained that the pain in her legs was becoming unbearable and she wanted to try something unconventional, he started talking about God's plan and hinted that sacrifice for the Lord is not always evil, but sometimes the way to salvation. He recalled biblical stories where people gave up their most precious possessions to get through trials. For Miriam, it all sounded too radical, although she hadn't realized how far her husband was capable of going with such rhetoric. We don't want you to die. These words spoken by Elijah one evening, when Miriam complained of a possible blood clot in her hamstring, provoked a panic attack. She imagined the worst possible scenarios, some kind of embolism or stroke, her critical condition in the hospital. And then Elijah's words came to mind, saying that amputation is painful, but it's still better than death. From then on, their conversations about health took on a gloomy tone. The pastor kept emphasizing that Dr. White had performed an examination and noted extremely dangerous blood vessels. To reinforce the impression, Elijah would bring home x-rays and excerpts of some tests, as if to prove that there was almost no lumen left in the vessels. Everything seemed quite official, as the doctor knew how to create the necessary documentation. Fear gripped Miriam more and more tightly. It was as if she subconsciously sensed something was wrong, but she continued to trust the person she considered the closest to her. Under the pressure of growing horror, she tried to avoid uncomfortable questions, withdrawing even more into herself. Meanwhile, she did not notice how dramatically her husband's character had changed. Some of the parishioners whispered that the pastor had become surprisingly short-tempered and angry. In his sermons, he spoke at length about severe trials and the need for willingness to sacrifice, although he did not explain the specifics. In addition, the situation at home was further complicated by an incident. One of the parishioners allegedly overheard Elijah loudly arguing with a stranger somewhere outside the church square, threatening him and assuring him that he would find the money to pay off the debt, otherwise God would not forgive him or the other. Miriam did not want to believe that this was her loving half, who had always been friendly and gentle. However, she continued to remain silent, convinced that all this was just the result of nerves and financial stress in the church. One day, during a period of high stress, Miriam finally agreed to visit Dr. White. But as soon as she stepped into her office, she immediately noticed the less than professional environment. There were almost no patients, the furniture was old, the walls were covered with papers, and the atmosphere was dull. The doctor greeted her with a strained smile. "Oh, Mrs. Griffin, I'm glad you came in. Your husband told me that the situation is critical. We must intervene immediately to prevent a tragedy." The word tragedy sounded harsh and painful, but Miriam was inclined to take it as a warning. Instead of a detailed examination, the doctor quickly looked at her legs and asked her general questions for about 20 minutes. After that, she announced her verdict. "Your blood vessels are on the verge of collapse. There is a threat of gangrene due to a blood clot. If you don't have an amputation, your chances of survival are extremely slim." Miriam, horrified, shrank back. "But in the other clinic, they told me about medicines and rest, not about—" "Time is running out," White interrupted her harshly. "You can postpone it, but you're playing with fire. I've seen it before. People delayed, and then it was too late. It seemed as if the ground beneath Miriam's feet was moving. Suddenly, Elijah appeared in the room, holding her hand tightly. "You have to listen to my advice. I will not let you die." She realized that she was faced with a difficult choice, either to agree with her husband and this doctor, or to dare to argue and confront them. However, religious pressure and loyalty to her husband did the trick. She just nodded silently, holding back tears. That evening, Elijah persuaded her to sign some life and health insurance documents, saying, "No matter what happens, the church will be able to help you if we get everything in order." In fact, the papers called for a $1.3 million payout in the event of amputation or a fatal complication. The pastor skillfully presented it as acting for her own good. The next day, he dialed the number of an insurance agent named Simon Reed, a young specialist newly assigned to the Anniston area. Appearing before him in his clerical garb and with the utmost courtesy, Elijah explained, "I want to provide for my wife. She is almost on the verge of disability. The papers from Dr. White will prove it." Simon, realizing how influential Holy Revival is in the city, did not hesitate and took the job of arranging the policy. Although he felt some uncertainty in his heart, why such a high limit of 1.3 million if there is still a chance to be cured? However, he had no evidence of anything suspicious yet. The next few weeks were spent in preparations, and Miriam cried incessantly at night, praying that the Lord would save her from this gloom. And her health was really deteriorating. Later, it would turn out that Dr. White had deliberately prescribed her medications that only made things worse. Finally, in desperation, Miriam agreed to have both her legs amputated, so she wouldn't die. In the morning, when she was brought to the surgery, she was silent and extinguished, did not protest, but only looked silently at Elijah, the only person she had ever pinned her hopes on. He seemed to be playing the role of a loving husband and spoke gently. "God is with you, my dear. I will stay here and pray. You will live." However, these words hid an evil plan, which now seemed to have been worked out to the smallest detail. The operation went surprisingly quickly because the doctor and her staff did not delve into the real state of the vessels. All the indicators were fudged, fake tests and critical findings. When Miriam woke up from anesthesia, she did not understand what had happened at first, but then she was in sharp pain and realized that she no longer had legs. Shock and despair turned into a silent scream inside her. She looked around for her husband's support, but caught his gaze, not filled with sympathy, but with a kind of relief or even cold composure. The next days passed for Miriam in a semi-forgotten state due to the strong painkillers. She tried to realize whether the amputation was really necessary. She remembered the words of other doctors who emphasized that such a step was taken only in extreme cases. The woman began to ask Elijah questions, but he just shrugged them off. "You are still weak. Remember what Dr. White said? Delaying could cost you your life." Miriam realized that in her condition she could not contradict him. Meanwhile, Elijah was on the phone with Simon Reed to clarify how to complete all the insurance documents. He was openly happy that the amputation had taken place and that they would have to pay the right amount. The pastor had lost the remnants of his conscience, believing that he could pay off his debts, rebuild the church, and perhaps strengthen his influence in the city. Miriam spent several days after the operation in a state of constant slumber. She was often awakened by phantom pain. She tried to move her legs, which were no longer there, and panicked, feeling fearful of her own powerlessness. Every morning, when Elijah came with a bouquet of flowers and an artificially polite smile, she saw in his eyes not regret or sadness, but rather relief. Sometimes it even seemed to her that he avoided eye contact whenever she tried to look him directly in the eye. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of Southern Life Solutions, the insurance company suddenly received demands from management to scrutinize large insurance claims more closely. Simon Reed, the same agent who had handled the Griffin's policy, began to scrutinize all the documents. He studied Dr. White's signatures, the dates on the tests, and suddenly noticed a strange discrepancy. The two forms indicating critical vascular conditions had dates next to each other, but they mentioned different days of blood sampling that did not coincide with Miriam's stay at the clinic. "What's this nonsense?" Simon muttered as he flipped through the documents. "It says here that the tests were taken on March 12th, but on the other form it says March 15th, even though the signature and results are the same. He immediately contacted the clinic where the tests were allegedly performed, but they never confirmed that Miriam had taken any tests on those days. The agent felt anxious because it all looked like a fraud. Realizing that the case could become publicized, especially given Pastor Griffin's status in the city, Simon began to collect evidence carefully, trying not to attract too much attention. He assumed that if he exposed the case too quickly, the perpetrators would be able to cover their tracks. While searching for information, he also began to gather information about Dr. White's past, assuming that similar cases might have already been in her practice. Quite unexpectedly, he came across an old newspaper article that mentioned that Dr. White had been investigated for misdiagnosis once before, but the case had been hushed up. At the same time, journalist Helen Carter of the Anniston Herald noticed an unusual news story. The wife of a well-known local pastor has had her legs suddenly amputated due to some critical illness. However, local doctors with whom she had good connections assured her, "We have never heard of Miriam having such a serious condition. On the contrary, last year she was quite successfully treated with physiotherapy." Being inquisitive by nature, Helen decided to investigate the topic further. She decided to interview Miriam, who was in the hospital, directly. Initially, Miriam, depressed after losing her legs, was not very talkative. But the journalist convinced her that this story needed to be covered, because many women with illnesses have no idea how to protect themselves from such radical decisions. "I was told that it was the only way to survive," Miriam said in a trembling voice. "Who exactly?" "Just your doctor?" Helen asked again. "Dr. White. And my husband, too. He said that there was not enough time, that the Lord willed it," Miriam explained, barely holding back her tears. "But I suspect that there may have been another option." The phrase "another treatment option" struck Helen like a lightning bolt. A terrible picture began to form in her mind. She wrote down what she had heard and then began to talk to former doctors who had treated Miriam. It also turned out that Simon was also investigating the case, and they met in a cozy coffee shop to confidentially share what they already knew. "I have these tests signed by Dr. White, but I'm sure they're fake," Simon said from the doorway, putting the folder of documents on the table. "The doctors are all telling me that there was an excessive medical intervention with no real basis at all." Helen supported him. "There is no chance but amputation. And yet, she says that her husband actually forced her to agree." Simon sighed heavily. "And they have an insurance policy for $1.3 million. If this is a conspiracy, this is the first time I've ever seen such a thing in my entire practice." They agreed to act cautiously. As a journalist, Helen had to take care not to actually leak the dirt until everything was confirmed. Simon, on the other hand, was going to prepare an official report for the insurance company to get the case moving, but he needed more solid evidence. Miriam's real medical history and Elijah's financial documents. And in the room where Miriam was lying, the doubts grew stronger and stronger. One day she noticed her husband speaking to Dr. White on a first-name basis, quietly and as if arguing or making excuses. When they saw that Miriam was looking at them, they instantly quieted down, and Elijah approached his wife with a polite smile. "How are you, my dear? Dr. White says you'll be discharged soon, but now your life is out of danger." Looking at him anxiously, she asked herself, who made the decision to recognize the life-threatening condition so hastily? And why all this? Could she really not do without the simultaneous amputation of both legs? Hundreds of questions swarmed in my head, to which Elijah did not give specific answers. Shortly before Miriam was discharged, another doctor, whom she had known before, came up to her and spoke quietly. "If in doubt, you should consult somewhere else, because your situation would not be interpreted as so critical." The woman shuddered at these words. Everything was turning inside her. So I could have avoided this maim. But then why did my husband? When Miriam returned home in her wheelchair, she noticed that Elijah had already arranged everything. A ramp had been built, furniture moved for convenience, but he did so without the usual warmth, as if he were fulfilling a dubious duty. And when she cautiously suggested, "Maybe I'll look for some doctors who can restore," he abruptly stopped the conversation. "It's enough, you've done everything, except the will of the Lord." That same night, the woman was left alone because Elijah had gone to take care of business, most likely to process an insurance claim. Alone, Miriam was looking around the room when she saw his tablet, which had been left on by accident. She felt anxious in her chest. I have to understand at least a little bit. She went to the email section. There were several emails there. One was titled MS Test Confirmed from Dr. White. After reading it, Miriam was taken aback. Pastor, all the papers are ready. I corrected the dates and readings a little, so now everything matches the critical diagnosis. Now it's your turn. Miriam's hands were trembling and her heart was pounding. And there was another letter from Elijah himself where he wrote, if everything goes according to plan, I will get 1.3 million, pay off my debts and finally put these creditors in their place. The main thing is to convince her of the amputation as soon as possible. I'm tired of this. Thank you for your cooperation. Mixed feelings of shock and rage came over Miriam at the same time. She cried, feeling that she had lost not only her legs, but also the whole meaning of her life. It turned out that the man she trusted had carefully and cynically planned this scam for a lot of money, destroying her health and her former way of life. Sitting in the wheelchair, she could barely breathe, trying to pull herself together. Of course, she wanted to call the police right away, but she realized that she needed additional evidence, because otherwise she might be considered a poor victim. Now she had material evidence, correspondence that testified to this conspiracy. It was at this time that Elijah entered the house. Feeling that she was about to confront him, Miriam, seized with a crushing anger, looked him in the eye for the first time, directly and fearlessly, showing him the screen of her tablet. You arranged all this, didn't you? You deceived me. The pastor stared in surprise, and then his eyes flashed with rage. Do you even realize what you are doing? How dare you go through my private things? Private? Miriam broke down in hysterics. You took my legs for your debts. It's horrible. You've turned me into a cripple. You're a monster. Elijah, embarrassed, roughly snatched the tablet and closed the letters, his face flushed with blood. But without this, I would have gone bankrupt. We would have been kicked out of the house. The church would have collapsed, and you would have suffered from poverty too. You have no idea the pressure I was under. It was the only way out, he shouted, trying to justify himself, but it didn't matter. Miriam had made her choice, although she didn't know exactly what to do. The only thing that was beyond doubt was that she would not remain silent. I will go to the police. I'll tell them everything, she whispered, torn between rage and tears, and saw something like primal fear in his eyes. He grabbed her shoulders, almost pushing her off the cart, but then backed away. Let's see how you prove that you were against the operation. Maybe they'll think you're crazy. And who would believe you? I'm a pastor, I'm respected here, and you are nothing without me. However, she squinted and her voice sounded like iron determination. I will prove it. I have your letters. I'm not afraid anymore. You are finished, Elijah. The pastor seemed to be at a loss. He did not expect this woman, who he thought was weak and completely dependent, to suddenly be so unyielding. The next morning, despite her severe physical and mental condition, Miriam decided not to delay. She contacted the journalist Helen Carter and briefly summarized the correspondence she had found on her tablet. It turned out that Helen had already been in contact with Simon Reed, an insurance agent who was also looking for evidence of fraud. I know you're scared, Helen said, but if you don't provide proof right away, your husband will take the money and maybe run away or influence someone. This nightmare has gone on for too long. I'll give you all the screenshots from the correspondence between Elijah and Dr. White. Just help me prove that he is a criminal, Miriam said, barely holding back her tears. The journalist promised to respond quickly. After collecting the materials, she met Simon in a small coffee shop. Their evidence was now irrefutable. Fake medical certificates, testimony from doctors confirming that the surgery was unnecessary, and emails clearly showing a conspiracy between the preacher and Dr. White. On the same day, Simon officially appealed to the leaders of his insurance company. They, in turn, involved the legal department, which immediately filed a complaint with the police, stating that the payment would be suspended until the investigation was completed. Law enforcement officials were enthusiastic about the case. In quiet Anniston, a case like this is a sensation, so they were happy to expose the alleged fraud. and one that involved a well-known pastor. At the same time, Helen began preparing an extended story for the Anniston Herald, but decided not to print anything yet. She wanted to get the official police position and collect clear evidence. The plan was to cover the story in a way that would give Miriam herself a chance to speak and reveal the deception scheme in detail. Meanwhile, Elijah himself was unaware of the joint steps taken by Simon, Helen, and his wife. He believed that Miriam was intimidated and would not dare to publicly confront him. Therefore, in an effort to speed up the money, the pastor went to the insurance company, hiding behind his spiritual authority. However, he was told in a calm tone that it would take a few more days until the routine inspection was completed. This alarmed him, but he believed that no one could prove anything at this stage. However, 2 days later, when Elijah went to the bank to withdraw several $1,000s from the church account, he was stopped at the door by 2 city detectives. They asked him to come with them to explain certain circumstances. At first, the pastor was surprised. Then he began to resist. "Do you realize who you are talking to? I am the pastor of this community. I have a parish. He began, but one detective just showed the warrant. The document stated that he was considered a suspect in insurance fraud and deliberate deception of his wife, which caused her serious health damage. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said in a low voice. Elijah was confused and began to scream, "This is slander. I was just saving my wife. You don't understand. She agreed to it." However, the police remained calm, calling for order. At about the same time, Dr. White was detained. She tried to deny it, saying, "I had the results of the examination." But the cops showed her the emails, which showed in black and white the falsification of information and the agreement on additional fees. There was no point in denying it any longer. The testimony of other doctors and the data from her clinic's internal audit formed a strong chain of evidence. A real scandal erupted among the parishioners who learned of Elijah's arrest. Some were convinced that the pastor was a true servant of the Lord and had become a victim of slander. Others, having learned the details of the story, including the fact that Miriam had lost her legs for the sake of his criminal plan, were shocked and outraged. Groups of people gathered outside the church, some praying for enlightenment for the pastor, while others demanded that the religious council explain how this could have happened. It was that night that Miriam received a call from Helen. "Your husband has been arrested. Don't worry, the police have enough evidence to charge him." Hearing this, she burst into bitter tears, mixed tears of relief and pain, because she still loved this man, saw him as a father to her future children. Now everything turned out to be a terrible nightmare. A few weeks later, the case gained media coverage. A large article by Helen Carter appeared in the Anniston Herald with the headline, "Pastor's Betrayal or Fatal Fraud." The article provoked a strong reaction from the community. Everyone learned about the fake diagnoses, the collusion with a corrupt doctor, and the $1.3 million in insurance that was never paid. The court hearing begins. The courtroom is crowded with journalists, parishioners, and the couple's friends and family. Elijah enters with a stone face and handcuffs. Dr. White is brought in separately. Miriam is brought in a wheelchair, with a social worker by her side, and Helen supporting her morally. The prosecutor presents specific charges: fraud for the purpose of insurance payment, deliberate misrepresentation with intent to cause serious harm, amputation, alleged conspiracy and corruption involving the doctor. A number of witnesses are called during the trial. Doctors who confirmed that there were no imminent indications for amputation. Insurance agent Simon Reed, who demonstrates all the inconsistencies in the documents and provides correspondence between White and Elijah. Journalist Helen, who testifies about her own investigation and conversations with Miriam. The film culminates with Miriam's own testimony. Sitting in a wheelchair and barely holding back tears, she tells how she sincerely trusted her husband, convinced that he cared about her. She recalls how she was intimidated by words about the will of the Lord and mortal risks, while she did not know that Dr. White was receiving money for fake tests. In between her sentences, the room is so quiet, you can hear the sound of the air conditioner. The lawyer Elijah has hired is trying to convince her that the pastor also fell victim to the doctor's tricks. But the correspondence Miriam handed over to the investigation contradicts this version. It clearly records his words about criticality and his plan to get money to pay off his debts. Dr. White partially admits her crime, trying to shift most of the blame to the pastor. He came to me with requests to falsify certificates. I received a reward from him. However, the judge sees them both as cynical accomplices. After several days of hearings, the jury finds Elijah Griffin and Kendra White guilty. In the final judgment, the judge calls it a brazen conspiracy to cause irreparable harm to a person for personal gain. Elijah is facing a long prison term of at least 15 years. Dr. White faces several years in prison, as well as the revocation of her medical license. As the jury reads out its verdict, stifled sobs can be heard in the room. There are parishioners who have refused to believe that their pastor is capable of such a brutal fraud. But some of the people who had previously had doubts now bow their heads, recognizing the obviousness of the fraud. During the sentencing, Elijah makes one more attempt to justify himself. I wanted to save the church. Our roof was falling apart. I only wanted to do good. God knows I had no evil intentions, he says nervously, but it sounds too late and pathetic. The judge responds succinctly, there is no excuse for injuring your own wife under the guise of good intentions. After the court ceremony, Miriam feels devastated. She has a long road of rehabilitation and legal procedures ahead of her. The insurance company, despite the falsifications found, partially admits its guilt in negligent control of documents. Therefore, they are offering her monetary compensation, not $1.3 million, but some money to cover the costs of rehabilitation and help her recover. Holy Revival finds itself at the center of a scandal. For many people, the community has ceased to be a place of revelation because the story of how such disgusting fraud could be organized in the name of the Lord outraged people. Some parishioners have turned away from the church, while others are trying to unite and find a temporary preacher to restore their damaged reputation. Meanwhile, the old church building remains dilapidated, with repairs that were supposed to be paid for, with Elijah's winnings now impossible. The journalist Helen Carter publishes the final article. She not only exposes the crime itself, but also focuses on the story of Miriam, a woman who fell victim to a cruel deception but found the strength not to give in. Readers sincerely sympathize and organize support for Miriam. Some volunteers raise money to finance high-quality prosthetics and help her adapt to a new life. In the final scene, Miriam rides a wheelchair outside her yard for the first time. Her friend helps her get to the ramp, and suddenly a local resident with a disability approaches them, smiling gratefully. I read your story. You are extremely strong. Miriam barely smiles back, with tears in her eyes. Now she has lost her legs, her husband, and everything that had seemed stable before. But at the same time, she was freed from the lies and oppression and felt that justice could exist. Perhaps, she says in a low voice, I will find a way to move on with my life. I needed to know the truth. No matter how painful it is, the truth is above all. Several months have passed since the trial. Anniston, a town that was heatedly debating the scandal of the fraudulent pastor, is gradually returning to its normalcy. But nothing is the same as it once was. Elijah's passionate speeches are no longer heard in the Holy Revival Church, and deep distrust remains in the minds of the parishioners. Miriam, despite her emotional distress, began to diligently engage in her own rehabilitation. At first, she attended daily physiotherapy, where she was taught to exercise in a wheelchair. And later, thanks to the funds raised, she was able to have high-quality prostheses fitted. This path was painful and long, from unbearable phantom pains to psychological rejection of the new way of life. But against all odds, she developed an unwavering determination to prove that she would not remain a victim until the end of her days. Several neighbors and parishioners who had known Miriam for a long time banded together and began visiting her often to help with household chores. They would bring fresh groceries, prepare lunches, or just come to talk to her, trying to give her moral support. It was then that Miriam realized that there were people in her town capable of sincere compassion and mutual assistance, even though the community's spiritual leader turned out to be a criminal. Meanwhile, it is known that former Pastor Griffin was taken to the county jail, where he is to serve a considerable sentence. Miriam learned from the media that at first Elijah wanted to deny everything, and then he started talking about repentance. However, the court did not accept these emotional justifications. There was too much evidence that he had purposefully and cynically developed the scheme for material gain. The Aniston Religious Council made a formal decision to revoke Elijah's pastoral ministry and ban him from preaching anywhere in local churches. Dr. White was also convicted, albeit to a lesser sentence. Several of her former patients filed a class action complaint with the State Medical Association, and she lost her license and the ability to continue practicing medicine. For the insurance company, which almost paid out $1.3 million, the case was a signal to strengthen internal checks. Simon Reed was promoted because he was the one who managed to prevent massive fraud and save the company from huge losses. He would occasionally visit Miriam, asking about her condition and making sure that she was indeed receiving the promised compensation payments, although much less than the insurance, but sufficient to cover the costs of rehabilitation and remodeling. After the high-profile trial, many Aniston residents became much more skeptical of the church hierarchy. Discussions spread throughout the city. How could it be that a preacher we trusted was capable of such cruelty against his own wife? Someone mentioned that Elijah had always had a talent for playing with words and influencing people. Some criticized the excessive role of finance in church life. After Elijah's dismissal, the Holy Revival Church had to look for another pastor. But there were few applicants, as the community scrutinized each candidate, fearing a repeat of the scandal. A senior deacon, known for his virtues and modesty, temporarily took over, trying to restore the trust of the faithful and offering open meetings to discuss financial transparency and mutual aid. At the same time, the city concluded that stricter standards of control for private clinics and specialists were needed to prevent similar manipulations from occurring again. The State Department of Health conducted an audit of the facility where White worked and found numerous violations of licensing requirements.